The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Arabella Butterworth stood at the window of her family's crumbling townhouse, watching the grey streets of London blur behind rivulets of water. The fire in the grate had gone out hours ago, and there was no coal to relight it. There had been no coal for a week. Behind her, she could hear her mother's laboured breathing from the chaise, the persistent cough that had grown worse with each passing month. The physician had been clear. Warmer climates, better food, rest. All things that required money they did not have. Her father had died owing debts to half the gentlemen in London. The creditors had taken everything of value. The silver, the paintings, her mother's jewellery. All that remained was this house, mortgaged to its chimney pots, and the clothes on their backs. Arabella was 26. In the eyes of society, she was a spinster. A woman past her prime who had never received an offer of marriage. Once she had been considered pretty enough. Dark hair, grey eyes, a figure that was pleasing if not remarkable. But pretty did not pay debts, and her father's disgrace had ensured that no respectable gentleman would ally himself with the Butterworth name. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Tomorrow the last of their credit would expire. The butcher, the baker, the woman who brought milk. They would all demand payment that could not be made. And then what? The workhouse, the streets, a slow, grinding death that would take her mother first and herself soon after. A knock sounded at the door. Arabella startled. They received no visitors now. The servants had all been dismissed months ago, so she descended the stairs herself, her worn slippers silent on the bare wood, where carpets had once lain. She opened the door to find a man in severe black livery, holding an umbrella against the rain. Behind him, a carriage waited, so fine and so polished that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Miss Butterworth," the man said, his voice clipped and professional. "I am sent by His Grace, the Duke of Castledale. He requests the honour of your presence." Arabella stared at him. The Duke of Castledale. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in London knew it. He was one of the wealthiest men in England, master of vast estates in the north, and a fortune built on shipping and coal. He was also, by all accounts, a recluse, a man who had withdrawn from society years ago after some tragedy that was spoken of only in whispers. She had never met him, had never even seen him from a distance. Why would such a man summon her? "I do not understand," she said. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake, Miss Butterworth. His Grace was most specific. He wishes to discuss a matter of mutual benefit." "Will you come?" She should refuse. A young woman, unmarried, going alone to meet a strange man. It was improper beyond measure. But propriety was a luxury for those who could afford it. And Arabella Butterworth could afford nothing. She looked back at the dark hallway, at the stairs that led to her dying mother. What did she have to lose? "Let me fetch my cloak," she said. The carriage was warm, heated by some mechanism she did not understand. Arabella sat on velvet cushions and watched the familiar streets of her neighbourhood give way to the grand squares of Mayfair. The houses here were lit against the gloom, their windows glowing with wealth and comfort. The carriage stopped before the largest house on the square. Castledale House. It was a fortress of pale stone, its windows dark, its facade unwelcoming. No lights burned in the windows save for one, a single glow on the ground floor that seemed to pulse against the rain. The servant led her inside. The foyer was vast and cold, dominated by a sweeping staircase and portraits that seemed to watch from the walls. Their footsteps echoed as they walked, the only sound in the silent house. They stopped before a door. The servant knocked once, then opened it and stepped aside. "His Grace will see you now." Arabella entered. The room was a study, lined with books and dominated by a massive desk. A fire burned in the hearth, the first real warmth she had felt in days. And standing before that fire, his back to her, was a man. He was tall. That was her first impression. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the firelight. His hair was dark, touched with silver at the temples, and his posture was rigid, controlled, as if he held himself together by will alone. Miss Butterworth. His voice was low and cold, utterly without warmth. Please sit. She sat in the chair before the desk. Her heart was pounding, though she did not know why. There was something about this man, this room, this strange summons that felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. The Duke turned. Arabella's breath caught. He was not old, as she had somehow expected. Perhaps 35, with a face that might have been carved from marble. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a hard line. His eyes were the colour of winter ice, pale and piercing, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She did not look away. "You are wondering why I have summoned you," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He moved to the desk and picked up a sheaf of papers. "I have made inquiries about your situation, Miss Butterworth. Your father's debts, your mother's illness, the state of your finances. I know everything." Arabella felt heat flood her cheeks. "You had no right. I had every right. I am a man who makes informed decisions, and I have decided to make you an offer." He set the papers down and met her gaze. "I wish you to be my wife." The words hung in the air between them. Arabella stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon. You heard me perfectly well. I am proposing marriage. A contract, if you will. You will become the Duchess of Castledale. In exchange, I will pay your father's debts, provide for your mother's care, and ensure that you want for nothing for the rest of your life." This was madness. This was some cruel joke. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you offer such a thing? You do not know me. We have never met." "Because I require a wife," the Duke said, his voice flat. "My solicitors have been insistent. A man in my position must have an heir, must have someone to manage his household. And I have found that women of society are intolerable. They simper. They scheme. They come with expectations of affection that I cannot fulfill." He studied her face. "You, Miss Butterworth, are different. You are intelligent from what I am told. You are practical. You have no romantic illusions about marriage, and you have no other options. You will not expect love from me, and I will not pretend to offer it." The brutal honesty of his words should have offended her. Instead, they felt like a relief. No false promises, no pretty lies, just a transaction, clear and simple. "And what do you expect from this arrangement?" she asked. "Obedience in public, discretion in private. An heir when you are ready. Beyond that, your time is your own. You will have access to my homes, my libraries, my resources. You may pursue whatever interests you wish. I ask only that you do not embarrass the Castledale name, and that you do not expect things from me that I am unable to give." "Things like what?" "Warmth," he said. "Companionship. Love. I am incapable of such things, Miss Butterworth. I want you to understand that from the beginning. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." She should refuse. Everything proper and decent in her upbringing screamed that she should stand, walk out, and never look back. But then she thought of her mother, coughing in that cold room. She thought of the creditors who would come tomorrow. She thought of the workhouse, the streets, the slow death that awaited them both. What choice did she really have? When would the wedding take place? She asked. The Duke's expression did not change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. "Tomorrow. I have already obtained a special license. Tomorrow." It was too fast, too sudden, but perhaps that was better. Before she could think, before she could change her mind. "Very well," she said. "I accept. Good." The Duke pulled a bell cord. "My servants will see you home. You will be collected in the morning. And Miss Butterworth." "Yes, Your Grace. You have made a wise decision. Do not give me cause to regret it." The wedding was held in the private chapel of Castledale House. There were no guests save for the servants who acted as witnesses and the elderly vicar who performed the ceremony with trembling hands. Arabella wore a grey travelling dress. It was the finest thing she owned, though it was 2 seasons out of fashion and had been mended at the cuffs. The Duke wore black, as he had the day before. He spoke his vows in that same cold, measured voice, as if reciting a contract, which, she supposed, he was. When it was done, when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, and released her. Welcome to the family, Duchess. That afternoon, a carriage arrived at the Butterworth townhouse, not for Arabella, for her mother. She was to be transported to a sanatorium in the south of France, where the air was warm and the physicians were the finest money could buy. All expenses paid indefinitely. Mrs. Butterworth wept as she embraced her daughter. My darling girl, what have you done for me? What you would have done for me, Arabella replied. Now go, get well. I will write to you every week. She watched the carriage disappear into the London streets, carrying her mother toward hope, toward healing. Then she turned and walked back into Castledale House, into her new life, into her gilded prison. The first weeks of her marriage were a study in solitude. Arabella had expected coldness from her husband. He had promised nothing else, but the reality was starker than she had imagined. The Duke was a ghost in his own house. He took his meals alone in his study. He emerged only to attend to business, or to ride out on the vast estate that surrounded the London house. When they encountered each other in the corridors, he would incline his head, murmur "Your Grace," and pass without another word. She saw him precisely once a day, at dinner. They sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 40, eating in silence while footmen hovered like shadows. He never asked about her day, never inquired about her interests or her comfort. He simply ate, spoke briefly about matters of the estate, and retired to his study. The house itself was a mausoleum, grand and beautifully appointed, but lifeless. The curtains were kept drawn, the fires were kept low. The servants moved silently, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to disturb some sleeping creature. Arabella began to understand why they called him the Cold Duke. But she was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had survived poverty, disgrace, the slow death of hope. She would not be defeated by silence. She began with the library. It was vast, one of the finest private collections in England, and she lost herself in it for hours each day. She read histories, philosophies, novels in French and Italian. She educated herself in ways her impoverished girlhood had never allowed. Then she turned to the house. She spoke to Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, and began making changes. She had the curtains open to let in light. She ordered flowers for the public rooms. She visited the kitchens and discussed menus with the cook. Small things, perhaps, but the servants noticed. They began to smile when they saw her, began to speak in normal voices again, began to move through the house as if it were a home rather than a tomb. One morning, 3 weeks into her marriage, Arabella was arranging flowers in the morning room when a voice spoke from the doorway. "What are you doing?" She turned. The Duke stood there, his face unreadable. She had not seen him in daylight for days. In the pale morning sun, he looked tired. There were shadows beneath those ice-pale eyes, lines of tension around his mouth. "I am arranging flowers, Your Grace." She kept her voice calm, pleasant. "I thought the house could use some colour." He stared at the flowers as if they were some foreign object he could not comprehend. "I see." He turned to go, then stopped. "You have been making changes." "I have." "Does it displease you?" A long pause. "No, it does not displease me. Do as you wish." He left. It was the longest conversation they had had since their wedding. Progress, Arabella thought, however small. That evening at dinner, the Duke spoke without prompting for the first time. "I have business in the north next week, at Wintermere, the family seat. You will accompany me." It was not a request, but Arabella found she did not mind. Anything to escape the silence of this house. Anything to understand the man she had married. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good." He returned to his meal. Then, after a moment, the flowers. In the morning room. They are. He seemed to struggle for words. They are pleasant. Thank you, Arabella said softly. The Duke said nothing more, but for just a moment something flickered in those cold eyes, something that might have been human. Wintermere was a revelation. The estate sprawled across thousands of acres of wild northern moorland, dominated by a house that was less a home than a castle. Its grey stone walls rose against the wind-swept sky like something from a Gothic novel, all towers and battlements and windows that stared like empty eyes. But inside, to Arabella's surprise, there was warmth. The servants here were different from those in London. They smiled openly. They spoke to the Duke with something approaching familiarity, and he, in turn, seemed different, less rigid, less cold. Almost, if she squinted, human. This is where you grew up, Arabella said one evening. They were in the great hall, seated before a fire that roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The Duke had a glass of whisky in his hand. He had not retreated to his study tonight. Yes. My family has held these lands for 400 years. I spent my childhood here, climbing those hills, swimming in that lake, learning to ride on those moors. There was something in his voice, a softness she had never heard before. It sounded like grief. What happened to them? She asked quietly. Your family. The Duke was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice flat. There was a fire. 12 years ago. I was in London attending to business. By the time I received word, it was over. My father, my mother, my younger brother, Thomas. All gone in a single night. Arabella's heart clenched. I am so sorry. He shook his head, a sharp, dismissive movement. I do not speak of this. I do not. He stopped, seeming to struggle with himself. But you asked. And you are my wife. You deserve to know why you are married to a man made of stone. He drained his whiskey. The fire was not an accident. It was set deliberately by a man my father had dismissed from his service. A man who blamed our family for his ruin. He murdered them in their beds, then fled. We never found him. Arabella could not speak. The horror of it was beyond words. I arrived too late, the Duke continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The house was ash and rubble. I stood in the ruins, and I swore. I swore I would never, he stopped again, never let anyone close enough to lose. That is why I am cold, miss, your grace. That is why I cannot give you what other husbands give their wives. Not because I do not wish to, but because I do not know how anymore. I locked that part of myself away, and I have lost the key. Arabella rose from her chair. She crossed the space between them and knelt before him, her skirts pooling on the stone floor. She took his hands in hers. They were cold, despite the fire. Perhaps, she said softly, you do not need to find the key. Perhaps you only need someone patient enough to wait while you forge a new one. He stared at her. In the firelight, his eyes were not ice. They were silver, and in their depths, she saw something she had never expected to see. Pain, loneliness, and the faintest, most fragile flicker of hope. Arabella, he said. Her name. He had never used it before. Yes, Richard. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, made him look younger, almost handsome. You are a remarkable woman, do you know that? I am simply a woman who understands what it is to be alone. He raised her hand to his lips, not the cool, perfunctory kiss he had given on their wedding day. Something warmer, something that lingered. Perhaps, he said, we need not be quite so alone anymore. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a beginning. The weeks at Wintermere changed everything. Richard, as she now called him in private, began to emerge from his fortress of solitude. They took meals together, not at opposite ends of endless tables, but side by side in a small breakfast room overlooking the moors. They walked the grounds, and he told her stories of his childhood, the tree he had fallen from and broken his arm, the lake where he had learned to fish, the tower room where he had hidden from his tutors. In return, she told him of her own life, the slow decline of her family's fortunes, the years of shame and struggle, the moment she had opened the door to find his carriage waiting in the rain. "I thought you were mad," she admitted one afternoon. They were sitting on a blanket by the lake, the autumn sun warm on their faces. "To propose to a woman you had never met." "I thought you were desperate," he replied. "To accept a proposal from a man you had never met." She laughed. It was, she realized, the first time she had truly laughed since her father's death. "I was desperate. Desperate enough to marry a monster." His expression flickered, and she realized her mistake. "That is what they call me, is it not? The Cold Duke, the monster of Castledale." "I did not mean. I know what you meant." He turned to look out at the lake. "And they are not entirely wrong. I have been monstrous in my way. I have shut out everyone who might have cared for me. I have made this house into a prison of silence and grief. I have wasted 12 years mourning when I should have been living." He looked back at her. "Until you." Arabella felt her heart quicken. "Richard." "I do not know how to love," he said slowly. "I do not know if I can learn. But I know that when you are near, the cold does not feel quite so bitter. I know that your voice is the first thing that has made me want to listen in years. I know that I look forward to each day now, because you will be in it." It was not a declaration, not the flowery speeches she had read about in novels. But it was real, it was honest, and it meant more to her than all the pretty words in the world. "I do not need you to love me," she said softly. "I only need you to try." He took her hand, raised it to his lips. "Then I will try. For you, Arabella, I will try." They returned to London as the first frost touched the ground, but the house they returned to was different. Or perhaps they were different. The changes Arabella had begun before their departure had continued in their absence. The house was lighter now, warmer. The curtains were open. Fresh flowers graced every room. The servants moved through the halls with purpose and energy, not like shadows afraid of their own footsteps. And Richard, her cold, distant husband, was changing too. He began taking breakfast with her each morning. He sought her out in the library to discuss the books she was reading. He accompanied her on walks through the park, though he still flinched when anyone recognized them. One evening, he came to her sitting room while she was writing letters. He stood in the doorway uncertain, as if asking permission to enter his own home. "May I join you?" "Of course." She set aside her pen. He sat in the chair across from her, his long fingers drumming on the armrest. "There is something I wish to show you." "What is it?" He hesitated. "Something I have never shown anyone." "It is." He stopped, tried again. "It is where I go when the darkness becomes too heavy. Will you come with me?" Arabella rose without hesitation. "Lead the way." He led her through the house, up stairs she had never climbed, down corridors she had never explored. Finally, they reached a door at the end of a long gallery. Richard produced a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped aside to let her enter. It was a room filled with light. Even now, with darkness falling outside, the space seemed to glow. The walls were covered with paintings, dozens of them, hundreds. Landscapes, portraits, still lifes. And in the center of the room, an easel with a half-finished canvas. "You painted these?" Arabella breathed. "Some of them." He moved to stand beside her, his voice uncertain. "It is something I have done since I was a boy. After the fire, it was the only thing that kept me sane. When I could not speak my grief, I painted it." She moved through the room, studying the canvases. They were beautiful. Dark and brooding, many of them, filled with storm clouds and turbulent seas. But others were different. A sunrise over the moors at Wintermere. A garden in full bloom. A woman's face half-turned, her features obscured. "Who is she?" Arabella asked, pausing before the last painting. "I did not know. Until now." Richard came to stand behind her. "She is hope. She is the dream of something I thought I could never have. She is." He paused. She is you, Arabella? Or she will be when I find the courage to finish. Arabella turned to face him. In the soft light of the studio, his face was open, vulnerable, all his armor stripped away. You have been painting me. Trying to. He gave a rueful smile. You are not an easy subject. You do not stay still long enough, because there is too much to do. She gestured at the room around them. Why did you never tell me? Why hide this part of yourself? Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let you see the real me, you would. He stopped. She would what? Leave. Despise me. See the grief and the darkness, and decide that a cold, practical arrangement was better than truly knowing the broken man behind it. She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, to see the pulse beating in his throat. I see you, she said softly. I have seen you from the beginning. The cold, yes. The grief, yes. But also the man who saved my family without asking for gratitude. The man who gave me freedom when he could have demanded servitude. The man who is trying every day to find his way back to the living. Richard. She reached up and touched his face, and I am not going anywhere. His eyes closed. A shudder ran through him. Arabella, I do not. I cannot. Then do not say anything. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, tentative, a question rather than an answer. For a moment, he stood frozen. Then his arms came around her and he was kissing her back, not gently, not tentatively, with a hunger that had been locked away for 12 years. They broke apart, both breathing hard. His forehead rested against hers. That, he said unsteadily, was not part of our arrangement. No, she smiled. Consider it a renegotiation of terms. The darkness did not lift all at once. Richard still had days when the grief pulled him under, when he retreated to his study and would not emerge for hours. But now, when he surfaced, Arabella was there, waiting, patient. And slowly, like spring thawing frozen ground, he began to trust that she would always be there. They attended their first ball together a month later. The ton was agog, the cold Duke emerging from his self-imposed exile, and on his arm, the former Miss Butterworth, the impoverished spinster who had somehow become a duchess. Arabella wore sapphires that night, a gift from Richard. They matched the gown he had commissioned for her, a confection of blue silk that made her feel like someone from a fairy tale. You look beautiful, Richard said as their carriage approached the venue. You look terrified, she replied. I am. I have not attended a function like this in years. They will stare. They will whisper. They will say I am. I know what they will say. Arabella took his hand, and I do not care. Do you? He considered this. No, he squeezed her fingers. I do not believe I do. They entered the ballroom together. The whispers began immediately, a wave of sound that rippled through the crowd. Arabella lifted her chin and did not look away from a single staring eye. If they wished to see the cold Duke's unsuitable wife, let them see her. Let them see that she was not ashamed. The evening passed, in a blur of introductions and careful conversations. Richard was stiff at first, his old armour clanking back into place. But as the hours wore on, as Arabella kept her hand on his arm and her smile on her face, he began to relax. They danced twice. The first time was a formal minuet, all proper distance and measured steps. The second was a waltz, and Richard held her closer than propriety allowed. His lips brushed her ear. Thank you, he murmured. For what? For making me brave. When they returned home that night, Richard did not retire to his study. He came to her sitting room, poured them both brandy, and sat beside her on the settee. I believe, he said slowly, that I have been a fool. Only believe, she raised an eyebrow. He smiled. It was still rare, that smile, but it was coming more often now. I married you because I was lonely, because I needed an heir, because I thought a practical arrangement would protect me from feeling anything ever again. And instead you felt something anyway. Yes. He set down his glass and took her hands. I did not expect you, Arabella. I did not expect to find a partner where I sought a convenience. I did not expect to find light where I had become accustomed to darkness. Her heart was pounding. Richard, I love you, he said. The words came out rough, as if he had to drag them from somewhere deep inside. I do not know when it happened. Perhaps it has been happening since the moment you walked into my study, so fierce and frightened and determined. But I know that I love you, that this cold heart of mine has somehow learned to beat again, and it beats for you. Arabella could not speak. Tears were streaming down her face. I know it is not what we agreed, he continued. I know I promised you freedom from expectation. If you do not feel the same, I will understand. I will not burden you with. She kissed him. It was the only way to stop the flood of words. She kissed him until they were both breathless, until the tears on her cheeks had transferred to his. I love you too, she said when they finally broke apart. I have loved you since Wintermere, since you showed me your grief and trusted me to hold it, since you began to thaw and I realized that beneath all that ice was the kindest, most beautiful soul I had ever known. Richard pulled her into his arms. She felt him shake, felt the wetness against her hair that told her he was crying, the cold Duke, the monster of Castle Dale, crying in his wife's arms because she loved him. I do not deserve you, he whispered. No, she pulled back to look at him. We do not deserve each other. We have both suffered. We have both been broken. But perhaps that is why we fit. Two broken pieces, finding their match. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corners of her mouth. Then let us be broken together, for as long as we both shall live. A year later, Arabella's mother came to visit. She had recovered fully, the warm air and skilled physicians having worked their miracle. She was brown from the southern sun, laughing and healthy, barely recognizable as the wasting woman Arabella had watched climb into a carriage on the worst day of her life. My darling, Mrs. Butterworth said, embracing her daughter in the sun-filled morning room. Look at you. Look at this house. Look at everything. You did this. You saved us. No, Mamma. Arabella glanced at the doorway where Richard stood watching with a small smile. We saved each other. That evening there was a dinner party. Small, intimate, just family and a few close friends. Richard sat at the head of the table, no longer at an impossible distance but within easy reach of his wife's hand. He laughed at something Mrs. Butterworth said. He debated politics with their neighbour, Lord Ashby. He behaved, in short, like a man who had remembered how to be human. After the guests had gone and the house had fallen quiet, Richard and Arabella walked in the garden. The roses were in bloom, the same roses she had planted in her first months as Duchess. They represented hope, she had told him, the belief that even the coldest ground could yield something beautiful. I have been thinking, Richard said. Dangerous habit, she smiled. What have you been thinking about? The portrait. The one I started, of you, of hope. He stopped and turned to face her, moonlight silvering his features. I finished it last week. You did. She felt a flutter in her chest. May I see it? He led her back into the house, up the familiar stairs, down the corridor to the studio that had become their sanctuary. The painting sat on the easel covered with a cloth. Richard hesitated, then pulled the cloth away. Arabella gasped. It was her. But it was not just her. It was her as she saw herself in her best moments, strong and gentle, fierce and soft, a woman who had known hardship and emerged tempered by it, a woman who was loved. This is how you see me, she whispered. This is who you are, Richard replied. The hope I thought I had lost, the light I thought would never return. You saved me, Arabella, not from poverty or loneliness, but from myself. From the cold, dark grave I was digging in my own heart. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. I love you, Richard Blackwood. More than I ever thought possible to love anyone. He gathered her into his arms, pressed his lips to her hair. And I love you, Arabella Blackwood. My wife, my Duchess, my heart. They stood there in the moonlit studio, surrounded by paintings of storms and sunrises, darkness and light, two people who had married for practicality and found something infinitely more precious. Outside, the world went on with its gossip and its judgments. They would always talk about the cold duke and his unsuitable wife. Let them talk. Within these walls there was only warmth, there was only love, there was only two souls, once broken and lonely, now whole and together. And that was more than enough. It was everything.